you will be able to access it later. I think the PowerPoint is also made available. So, and as George said, if you have questions, just put them in the chat box and we'll see how our time goes. We're trying to get all this information crammed in for you in 90 minutes or less. So if we have time to answer questions in between, we'll do it. Otherwise, we will hang around to do that towards the end. So, okay, go ahead to the next one, George. All right, so we're talking about the Medicaid program today. And I don't want you to get overwhelmed by the slides because we made them somewhat technical, put a lot of information in them, but we're going to try to present this in an understandable way and talk in plain English so that you can walk away feeling like you got a good understanding of how the Medicaid program works. Medicaid is a very complex program and it is rule driven. So, so again, our goal is to make this understandable for you. And part of that will be that we're going to break down different sections so that you're not listening to the same voice droning on. So essentially what we want to cover over the next 90 minutes is what you're looking at right now. We're going to talk about what is Medicaid, who can receive Medicaid services or Medicaid coverage, what are the situations where Medicaid will help? And then how do we become Medicaid eligible? If we decide it's appropriate and we want to get Medicaid, how do we become eligible? Then how does the actual application work? What's the process like? And then once we are able to achieve Medicaid eligibility, what happens next? How do we stay Medicaid eligible in the future? And then we'll also touch upon what happens when we die. And then is there going to be a Medicaid estate recovery that tries to recover costs for our Medicaid while we were alive? So go ahead, George. All right, so we're going to start off talking about myths and misconceptions. So what you're seeing here is some half-truths that, for example, you may have heard that it's the federal government that runs the Medicaid program. That's a half-truth. That Medicaid is only for poor people. That's a half-truth. As well as Medicaid is government-provided medical care. So let's debunk that. So what is Medicaid? So Medicaid is a public benefit program that provides access to health care for people with limited means. And we're going to break that down further. But what I want to say is that Medicaid is a federal state program. So it starts with the federal government, and federal government allows states to choose for themselves whether they want to participate in the Medicaid program. And in order, if a state chooses to participate, they have to meet certain federal requirements. And then they also have to put up part of the funding. So the federal government pays about 60 cents of every dollar for Medicaid, and then the local government or the state government puts up the other 40 cents. So in order to opt into the Medicaid program, the state must elect to, or must agree to meet the minimum federal requirements for the coverage that it's going to pay for. And then each state can also elect to, in addition to meeting the minimum federal requirements, to also ask the federal government for waivers so that they can offer Medicaid plus some additional services, maybe for certain categories of people or for certain type of service. And we'll get into that. Essentially, as of this point, every state in the country does participate in the Medicaid program. What you'll see, though, is that there may be differences between the states and what they're offering. So today we're obviously talking about Ohio's Medicaid programs. In order to be eligible for Medicaid, the individual has to either be a United States citizen or have a permanent legal status. In order to be eligible for Ohio Medicaid, they have to be an Ohio resident. And there's nothing magical in the definition of Ohio resident. It just simply means that I'm physically present in the state of Ohio and I intend to remain here. That's pretty much it. And then the third criteria, general criteria, is that in order to get Medicaid, we have to have limited means. And we'll get into what that specifically means. Okay. All right. Who can receive Medicaid? So here's some more myths and misconceptions. Only the very poorest people can get Medicaid. You're going to see shortly that that is not quite true. Another misconception is that people who work, who have jobs, don't need Medicaid. And that's not true either, because not every employer offers health coverage. And sometimes if you don't make enough of an income, you may qualify for Medicaid as well. And then thirdly, people with Medicare or other insurance cannot get Medicaid. And that's not true either. You can have Medicare and Medicaid. Go ahead. All right, so I would categorize Ohio's Medicaid program to just kind of two basic categories. One is base Medicaid service, base Medicaid programs, and you'll see those on the right in the green bar. They're a little different, but all of those programs will receive the basic Medicaid coverage, which is like medical coverage that you or I might be receiving through Medical Mutual or any of the other insurance plans, is where it's essentially providing basic medical coverage. And then the other category of Medicaid programs in Ohio is what we call long-term care services and supports category, which means that they're providing the basic coverage plus some additional services that don't quite look like medical care, but they're services and supports to help us stay in the community. Okay. All right, so who can receive Medicaid? So this is the debunking of the misconception. So the basic Medicaid program, as I said, is the regular insurance, and that will cover things like hospitalization, outpatient care, doctor visits, prescription medication. And sometimes if somebody has other coverage, say Medicare, which we become entitled to when we reach age 65, or if we become disabled and start drawing down Social Security disability benefits, we will get Medicare. In those situations, we can also, if we meet the other criteria, we can also have Medicaid. And in that situation where we're set to be duly eligible, Medicare will always be the primary coverage, and then Medicaid will act as the secondary or the payer of last resort to pay the things that Medicare does not cover. Long-term care Medicaid covers nursing home care, assisted living, home care, and other services in the community that we typically call waivers. And in order to qualify for long-term care, you must first have a medical need. So you have what we call a level of care. And George is going to talk about level of care in a little more detail later. But you have a medical need for some type of a service, and that you also qualify under one of those base categories for Medicaid coverage. And then you can then potentially qualify for the long-term care Medicaid. The last bullet there on the bottom just mentions that the financial requirements that apply to the base Medicaid program are slightly different for long-term care Medicaid program, and we'll get into that as well. Okay. All right. So breaking down the base eligibility programs for Medicaid. So the first one is what we call MAGI Medicaid, and MAGI stands for Modified Adjusted Gross Income, because that's the eligibility criteria to qualifying for this Medicaid program. We didn't have MAGI Medicaid before Affordable Care Act. So Ohio added on this MAGI Medicaid with the passage and implementation of the Affordable Care Act. And essentially what MAGI says is that if your income is 138% or less of the federal poverty level, that's based on your modified adjusted gross income that's reported on your tax return, and you are younger than 65, and you're not eligible for Medicare, you're currently not receiving Medicare or any other Medicaid program, you can qualify for the MAGI Medicaid. The other piece that's different than from the other Medicaid programs that we're going to review is that you do not need to be disabled. You do not need to be considered disabled to qualify for MAGI Medicaid. You only need to meet the income requirement. And as you can see, the 138% of federal poverty level in 2024 is $1,732 for an individual who is a household of one. So those numbers change depending on how many people make up a household, and they also change year to year. The government adjusts those figures, but that's the number that's current right now. The other important distinction is that it doesn't matter what your resources are. So a resource is something that we already have. So in Medicaid world, they have a different definition of income than resources. Income is the money that I receive during the month. It could be my paycheck. It could be maybe well, no, that's not a good example. Maybe somebody gives me a birthday present of cash. That's the month that I receive it, it's considered income. To the extent that I don't spend it, so say I received a paycheck in November and I didn't spend it all, that portion that I still have in December is now considered a resource. So that's all those assets that we have that could be making up our bank account balances, that could be our retirement accounts, any of those kinds of things, our houses, our cars, anything that can be easily converted to cash, those are considered resources. And under the MAGI Medicaid program, unlike the other Medicaid programs, they're not looking at our resources. So you could be a millionaire, but if you don't have an income that's at least $1,732 a month, you could qualify for MAGI Medicaid. Okay. All right. Another base Medicaid program is called the Medicaid Buy-in for Workers with Disabilities. So this is a Medicaid program that is targeted at individuals that either have been on Medicaid and were not working, and now they get a job, and they still need that Medicaid coverage. Or it can be for anyone who is, well, you see the criteria there. You have to be between ages of 16 and 64. You do have to meet Social Security's definition of disabled. They have a specific definition of who they consider disabled, and Medicaid in Ohio uses that same definition for disability. So if you meet, and you can easily know who meets that definition by if you know that they're receiving SSI or they're receiving Social Security disability, then we know that they met the definition because those are requirements for either of those two. You have to be employed, and it doesn't matter whether it's full-time or part-time, as long as you're working. And you have to earn no more than 250% of the federal poverty level in income. So that in 2024, that equals $3,138 for a household of one. There are some disregards and credits that, when they do their calculation to see if somebody's qualified, if there are certain like work-related expenses, they may discount that. So even if you're making $3,138 more than that, when they do their evaluation, they're going to reduce that sum. You have to meet the citizenship requirements. In other words, you're either a citizen or you have a permanent status, and you have to live in Ohio. And then your resources, that's those funds that you have sitting that Magi Medicaid doesn't care about. Medicaid buy-in does care, but they allow you to have up to $14,848 total, and still get the Medicaid buy-in. And finally, if your income is low, you may not have to pay any premiums at all. But if your income is between 150% of the federal poverty level and 250%, then you're going to be charged a premium. And it's kind of a graduated. And if you're wondering what 150% of federal poverty level looks like, that's $1,883 a month for a household of one. Okay. All right, another base type of base Medicaid program is what we call the ABD Medicaid. Sometimes it's been called Community Medicaid, but ABD Medicaid stands for age, blind, or disabled. So there's special set of rules for age, blind, disabled Medicaid. The eligibility for that is you either have to be aged, which they define as 65 or older, you have to be blind, or you have to meet the disability definition under Social Security rules. So any one of those three gets you past that first prong. And then there is an income and resource limit. So your income cannot not be more than $943 a month for a single individual. If the applicant is married, then the combined income of both spouses can't exceed $1,415. Those numbers change every year. So the numbers we're giving you are for 2024, but just be aware that those figures get adjusted every year. The resource limit, which interestingly does not get adjusted year to year, is $2,000 for a single individual and $3,000 for a married couple. So that's the money that's sitting there in the bank or the retirement or whatever. That's the resource limit to get qualified for the ABD Medicaid. Anyone that qualifies or is receiving SSI, which is Supplemental Security Income that's provided through Social Security Administration, will automatically qualify for Medicaid. So years ago, prior to 2016, if we had an individual that turned 18 and was going to apply for SSI, and they got their SSI and they wanted Medicaid, they would have to separately apply with the local Job and Family Services to get the Medicaid. So there'd be two different agencies that would be deciding eligibility. But Ohio changed the program that they participate in. And so as of 2016, you only have to do one application, which is to Social Security. And if you get the SSI, you will automatically, without doing anything further, receive a Medicaid card and be eligible for the ABD Medicaid. Okay. All right, so nursing home Medicaid, we're getting into that long-term care Medicaid program. So what we talked about up to now is that base Medicaid eligibility. in order to get nursing home Medicaid, sometimes we've called it institutional Medicaid or just nursing home Medicaid. There's two parts to the eligibility. You have to first meet a nursing facility level of care. In other words, you have to have the type of level of care need that requires 24-hour care, that requires that you be somewhere that you can receive that type of care. And then secondly, that you have that base Medicaid eligibility. In other words, you meet the income test and you meet the asset test. Now, the income test is going to be a little different than it is for ABD Medicaid. And the asset test will be the same. It's for a single individual, it's $2,000. For a married couple, it's different, and we'll get into that a little bit later. If you're looking for nursing home Medicaid and you're on MAGI, interestingly enough, if you're under that age of 60, you can get nursing home coverage paid through MAGI, and because MAGI doesn't have a resource test, then you don't have to worry about what's in the bank account. You can still qualify for that nursing home Medicaid if you're coming through under MAGI. All right, and then we talked about the financial criteria being
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, I just was reading along. All right. Now, in addition to nursing home Medicaid, we also have the Medicaid waiver. So that's all part of that long-term care Medicaid coverage. And Medicaid waivers are, like I said earlier, is getting that base medical coverage plus something extra. So in Ohio, we have these actually 4 sets of Medicaid waivers that are available to individual people. And the point of waivers is to try to keep folks out of nursing homes. In other words, we're saying, if we didn't have these waivers, these individuals have a similar need that they might require 24-hour care in a nursing facility. So that this is a way to help someone stay in the community, and it should be less costly than having someone in a 24-hour facility. So the first one of those is Passport and Ohio home care waivers. So home and community-based programs allow an individual to live at home in the community. So the home care waiver is for people who are anywhere from birth to age 59, as opposed to Passport is for folks who are 60 or older. They want to stay in their own home, but they need assistance. So they have to have the same nursing facility level of care, need assistance with their activities of daily living, and then they have to meet the same financial criteria as someone that's applying for a nursing home. So again, for a single person, that's no more than $2,000 in countable resources. The assisted living waiver program is for somebody who's age 21 or older, also has that nursing, that level of care that applies to a nursing facility. If they're in a assisted living facility, that facility has to have an available slot for them. And so just to back up a second, so in Ohio, we have assisted living facilities that do not have to participate in the Medicaid program. They can choose to participate or not. So that's one thing to think about when you're looking at assisted living is, does this facility accept a Medicaid waiver? But if they do choose to participate, they can put on additional restrictions. So many of them will say, we're only going to have this many slots available, and the rest will be our private pay folks. Or they can say, we're only going to give slots to those residents that have been living with us and have private paid for their care for a year or 6 months or whatever. So they're all slightly different. So they have to have an available slot, and then you have to meet the financial criteria in order to get the waiver. Then the last category of waivers is those that are made available through the county DD board, board services. So every county has a board of developmental disabilities, and they make waivers available for individuals that are eligible to receive their services. And then that will cover, again, the cost of the medical care, and then certain services and supports that the individual will need in order to be able to live safely in the community. Whether that's a group home setting or a supported living setting or independent. And again, they have to meet the same financial criteria. So all of these waiver programs have the same financial criteria. Okay. All right, then turn it to George.
Okay. So I just wanted to give a recap on some of these other programs, because we're going to dig in now to the nursing home and long-term care Medicaid. But when will Medicaid help is, when are you financially eligible? So for most Medicaid programs, they've got a limit of $2,000 in countable resources and an income limit based on the annual adjusted federal benefit rate. That's the SSI rate. So it's usually some percentage of that. Medicaid buy-in has the higher resource limit, has a higher income limit. MAGI is based solely on income, and it's one of the rare Medicaid programs where IRS income rules and Medicaid income rules largely overlap, but it has no resource limit. So these are the exceptions to the rule when we're talking about Medicaid, where we are talking about income limits and asset limits that you need to meet in order to get Medicaid coverage. So we're going to jump in now into the long-term care section, which is by far the most complex of the Medicaid systems and is where the bulk of our expertise comes into play, because this is where the working with the rules, you can often protect assets, you can preserve assets, you can make sure your assets are not spent down on care or saved for supplemental needs. Lots of opportunities in the long-term care context. So here's again, lots of myths, misconceptions, and not quite accurate information floating around. So these are some of the things that we hear people say that they hear about Medicaid in the long-term care and nursing home context. And if you look at some of these are even contradictory to one another. That if I need nursing home Medicaid, the government's going to take my house and all my money. Or I won't need Medicaid because I've got Medicare and supplemental insurance. These are all not correct. That one of the big ones is getting Medicaid means I have to go to a nursing home and only the bad ones take Medicaid. Well, as we're going to see in the nursing home context, every nursing facility is going to accept Medicaid with very few exceptions. Largely religious facilities that only provide care to people in their congregation. So it's more about finding a bed and finding a slot in one of these nursing homes. Once you get in, if you apply and are eligible for Medicaid, a nursing home will have to accept you as a Medicaid patient. Another one I hear a lot is, if I give away any money, then I can't get Medicaid. Well, there's rules about that, but that it's not quite that. And then conversely, we get this one a lot as well. Medicaid, it's okay if I give up to, I can give up to $18,000 a year. You hear this a lot. This is part of tax planning about that annual exclusion for the estate and gift tax. There is no exclusion, automatic exclusion for Medicaid gifting. And I hear this one quite a bit too when we're doing applications for spouses is, well, my husband and I, we keep all our assets completely separate. So why is Medicaid asking for my bank account? Why are they asking for my income it's my spouse that's applying. Why are they asking for my information? And as we're going to see, there's a reason why it's still necessary. So let's dig into these care needs. There's two really big, broad areas of criteria when you're talking about long-term care eligibility. We talk about the non-financial criteria and the financial criteria. So your non-financial criteria are largely, do you meet that care need? Do you have the requisite level of care in order to qualify for one of these long-term care programs? And so you have to have a nursing facility level of care, which requires at a minimum that you fall into one of these categories. So you either require hands-on help with 2 or more activities of daily living. We call these ADLs. These are bathing, dressing, grooming, mobility, walking or getting in and out of a chair, getting in and out of bed, eating. This is physically cutting up your food and being able to chew and swallow, and toileting. Can you use the facilities on your own, or do you need help with either getting there, getting on the toilet, getting off of it, getting cleaned up, all that? Or one of the other criteria is, do you need help with one of these ADLs and somebody who's managing your medication, making sure that you're taking the right medications at the right time of day, with food, without food, the blue pills on Wednesday, the pink pills on Tuesday, things like that. If you need help with one ADL and somebody to help manage medications, you meet that level of care. Do you require somebody to be present because you have a cognitive impairment that means that you may wander off, or may not know when an emergency is happening? If a fire alarm goes off, you may not realize what to do. Do you need somebody to be there so that you're safe because of diminished mental capacity? Or do you need at least one skilled nursing or rehab services? And in other words, are you otherwise needing that level of care, something that requires a skilled a nurse or a doctor to administer? So any one of those groups, you'll meet that level of care. So turning to financial criteria, as Elena alluded to, there is a distinction between income and assets or resources. So you have to meet eligibility criteria both in terms of your income and in terms of your assets. So what is income? So income is funds received on a regular basis. So your Social Security, your pensions, your paycheck. If you've got a fixed annuity that's making payments, if you have a retirement account that's making required minimum distributions, if you own a business and you get income from that business, lots of different ways of earning income. The key here is that this is new money that is coming in on some regular basis. Every 2 weeks, every month, twice a month. That's income. When we're talking about income eligibility, Medicaid always starts whatever sort of analysis they're going to do on your income. They're always going to start with the gross amount. This is the amount that is before any deductions or withholdings, offsets, things like that. They are going to look at that gross income, and then they may take offsets and deductions and from there. And generally, Medicaid is going to be concerned with your income monthly. So they have various formulas where if you get paid every 2 weeks, they'll factor it by 2.15. If you get it twice a month, they multiply it by 2. Things like that. Important thing to know and remember in the long-term care context, there is no absolute income limit. But if your income is 300% or more of that federal benefit rate, which in 2024 is $2,829, you have to take an extra step to become income eligible. You have to establish what's called a qualified income trust, or a QIT. Sometimes they call it a QUIT. You might hear somebody call it a Miller trust, but you won't hear that very often. This is essentially a workaround around some of the eligibility rules in the statutes that allows you to still be income eligible for Medicaid, even though your income is nominally over that limit. And that's all I'm going to say about QITs, because we could go on and on about them for at length. If you need one when you are applying for long-term care Medicaid, we would encourage you to talk to an elder law attorney, somebody like us, to give you the nitty-gritty on QITs. When you're talking about a married couple where one of the spouses is applying for long-term care Medicaid and the other spouse is not, Medicaid is only going to look at the income at the spouse that's applying. So this person is called the institutional spouse, and their spouse that is not applying for Medicaid, that is living in the community, is known as the community spouse. The community spouse's income is not counted for eligibility for the institutional spouse. What Medicaid considers income is different from what the IRS is going to consider income. Medicaid follows a very straightforward test: whose name is on the check, so to speak. In other words, who is the one who is entitled to receive this income? So, if you have two spouses and they both are getting Social Security and they are both having it deposited into their joint bank account, Medicaid's going to look at that Social Security award letter and say, okay, the institutional spouse's Social Security is their income, the community spouse's Social Security is their income. We're only going to test for eligibility based on the institutional spouse's income. Now, they're still going to want to see the community spouse's income, because there's going to be a lot of other reasons why they need to look at it. One of those being your community spouse may be entitled to some portion of the institutional spouse's income to meet their monthly needs. You often get a situation where, between two spouses, one of them was largely the one who worked and who was the breadwinner, and they're going to be going into the nursing home. Their Social Security is 80% of the combined couple's income. The community spouse has very little of their own income at all. In order to make sure that that community spouse is not impoverished, there's rules about how much the institutional spouse can give to their community spouse each month out of their income. So and there's other reasons why they're going to look at the community spouse's income beyond just eligibility purposes. Resources. Now, resources are anything that the person owns. And this is sort of the technical definition of this, is that it's something that the person owns or has a legal right to, that can be used or sold and converted to a form that can be used to pay for medical care. So what does that mean? So it's funds in the bank, it's real estate, stocks, bonds, investments, life insurance that has a cash value, vehicles, real assets, tangible and intangible assets, money, and other things like that. Now, resources can be countable or exempt and may be considered available or unavailable. So countable and exempt resources, these are things where the rules themselves say that this asset this resource is countable or not countable. The home is not countable because there's a specific rule that says it's not a countable resource. Available and unavailable is more of a case by case context. If somebody is applying for Medicaid and they are under a court appointed guardian, and or somebody is seeking guardianship but hasn't been appointed, there's no legal ability for that person to access their resources yet because a guardian hasn't been appointed and they're not capable themselves. Their resources may be considered unavailable to them during that time. And so even though they have resources that would otherwise be countable, because of their inability to access them at that particular moment in time, they would be considered unavailable and not considered in their eligibility. So only resources that are countable and available are considered for eligibility purposes. Exempt resources. So these are the main ones that you'll encounter in most cases. So the home, so it's the principal place of residence of the individual or their spouse. One vehicle of any value. So if you've got 3 cars, your most valuable one, the one that has the highest Blue Book value, is going to be not counted. It's going to be exempt from Medicaid for Medicaid eligibility purposes. Things like burial plots and irrevocable funeral contracts, prepaid funerals and prepaid burials, your personal belongings, household goods, so your stuff. They're not gonna care that you got a nice couch or that you have nice tools in the garage or things like that. Assets that are in a specifically exempt trust, such as a special needs trust, a pooled trust, or some other exempt form of trust, which, again, this is the kind of thing we could give an entire presentation for an hour and a half on just these things these things in trusts. And we have given that presentation, but you can often take advantage and use these various exempt forms to have assets not counted. Life insurance policies, in a very narrow context, if all of the policies that you own have a combined face value of less than $1,500, then they are not countable. I don't think I have ever actually seen this in the wild. Most of the time, these life insurance policies, they're going to have a face value of more than that, or you're going to have a number of small policies that add up to exceed that. If an asset is genuinely unmarketable or legally impossible to access or convert to cash, that's when you can argue that it is not available. You might see this, for example, in a case where you have a real property. Let's say 5 siblings inherited a real property and they don't get along. They can't agree to sell that property. Your 1/5 interest in that house. You could take your siblings to court and force a sale, but you'd have to pay an attorney 3 times more than what that interest is worth. If you can show Medicaid that that's the case, Medicaid could consider that asset unavailable and not count it towards your eligibility. So again, case by case basis. So when a single person or 2 spouses are both applying for Medicaid, pretty straightforward. Maximum of $2,000 for an unmarried person, or if both spouses are applying, they can have up to $3,000 in countable resources between the 2 of them. If there's an asset that's jointly owned, whether between the 2 spouses or if there's a third person, a sibling or a friend or whomever, a child that jointly owns that asset, the presumption is that the asset belongs in proportion. So if you've got 3 people on a bank account, they would presume that it's a third, a third, and a third. But if you can show that in actuality, what's in that account all came from one of the account holders, then they will count that, according to the, whoever contributed those funds. You see this a lot of times. An adult child will get put on mom or dad's bank account to help them with their bills. They'll be on there as a joint owner, but they're not going to say that there's 50% of that account that was given to that child, because you can trace all of the assets to mom or dad. As Elena talked about earlier, your income that you get in a month is not part of your resources until whatever is left that you didn't spend that month that's carried over into the next month. So if you've got $2,000 in your account at the beginning of the month and you get $1,500 in income in the middle of the month, and you spend $1,500 by the end of the month, then you've been resource eligible that entire time. Married person now with a spouse in the community. This is much more complicated when we're talking about resources. So the individual, the institutional spouse, still has that $2,000 limit. The community spouse is going to be allowed to retain a certain amount of the total resources of the couple. His, hers, ours, it doesn't matter at that junction. They're going to look at all of the resources of the spouses together. After the institutional spouse is determined eligible for Medicaid, then from that point forward, the community spouse's resources will not be considered available to the institutional spouse, so long as the institutional spouse stays otherwise eligible for Medicaid. So we do this a lot with our planning, where we will do some form of plan that will get the married couple down to their resource allowance, and we apply, with the plan being that then the community spouse is going to have their resources reaccumulate and grow. And so long as the community spouse keeps their resources on their side of the ledger, the institutional spouse is going to be able to continue receiving Medicaid going forward. At that first initial application, like I said, his, hers, ours, doesn't matter. They'll look at the whole thing together. They give you a year to get your assets separated, because at that first annual renewal, when Medicaid checks back in and looks at eligibility again for the institutional spouse, then they're going to want to see that in the institutional spouse's name, there is no more than $2,000 that they have available to them. So in other words, you have a year to transfer all of the assets out of the institutional spouse's name into the community spouse's name. So how do we figure out how much the community spouse is allowed to keep? This is where it gets complicated. So the community spouse resource allowance, it's based on the combined assets of the couple as of what's called the snapshot date. The snapshot date is either the first day of the month when either spouse began a continuous 30-day period of institutionalization. I'll come back to that. Or it's the date that the institutional spouse is applying for nursing home Medicaid. This continuous period of institutionalization is we will often call that the snapshot. I think technically the snapshot date could be the application date. Keep doing that. The idea here is we want to make sure that the community spouse gets to keep an amount of assets that are in proportion to what they've had, during their adult life, throughout the married couple's life together. Because what happens often is one of the spouses falls ill, their care needs get to the point where they need to start needing long-term care, and so they start spending their assets. They start paying that nursing home, they start paying for those home health aides. If Medicaid determined the resource allowance of the community spouse after they'd already spent a whole bunch of money on medical care, it wouldn't be fair, because they were taking care of their spouse and now they're applying for Medicaid. So essentially what they want to do is say, okay, we are going to look at your assets as they were when the spouse fell ill, when you started needing to pay for care. And so the way this works is they say, if you've had a 30-day continuous period where you've been hospitalized, rehab, nursing home, you never came home, you never left the facility, or you went from hospital to rehab, the month that started, we're going to look at your assets as of the first day of that month. That's how they will start the analysis for the community spouse resource allowance. Then they will say that the community spouse gets to keep half of the resources as of that snapshot date, unless that amount is above the maximum or below the minimum. So these are adjusted annually. Right now in 2024, the minimum community spouse resource allowance is a little over $30,000 in countable resources. The maximum is about $154,000. Again, countable resources. So we're not including the value of your home or the value of potentially your retirement account or things like that in that number. Then when applying, Medicaid is going to look to see, are the countable resources of the couple when they're applying less than the community spouse resource allowance and the $2,000 that the IS is allowed to have. If that's the case, then the institutional spouse will be approved for Medicaid on the first application. If there is no snapshot date, or if there is no period of institutionalization, I should say, and the combined resources are above that minimum amount, Medicaid will deny for the institutional spouse and then say what the community spouse resource allowance is and tell you to come back and reapply when you've spent down to that amount. What we usually will do in our planning is, if we don't have that 30-day period, we will do whatever sort of planning we need to do to get the couple below that minimum so that our first application goes through. Because again, most of the time our plan involves having the community spouse get to keep, or at least get to have their resources accumulate, build back up over time. Because again, CSRA is only relevant when that first application, when that initial eligibility determination is being made for the institutional spouse. If your community spouse has a resource allowance of $100,000, they don't have to keep themselves under $100,000 for the rest of time. They just have to be under that amount when they're first applying and getting the institutional spouse on Medicaid. Important to remember that. So that's resource eligibility. Now, how do we get to resource eligibility? Well, you can spend down, you can purchase exempt assets, or you can make gifts. What does Medicaid do if you give money away? So Medicaid wants to encourage you to use your resources for your own needs, but they can't require you to do that. So what they can do only is apply a penalty if you make improper transfers. So what is an improper transfer? Well, it's when you give away funds, money, property, that you give it to another person or you sell it to another person, but don't get its full value in return. So, If you sell your car to your kid for $500, or you sell your house to your neighbor for the amount that you got to pay off on the mortgage, but not its full market value, that could be an improper transfer. In the other portion of this is that the transfer was in fact done for the purpose of qualifying for Medicaid, which Medicaid's going to presume that's why you did it, but there is some wiggle room there to say, under certain circumstances, that wasn't the case. And then there's exemptions to the improper transfer rule. And as always, you can spend your funds on yourself or your spouse for any purpose. It doesn't have to be on something that's necessary or worthy or has to be on medical care or X, Y, and Z. So long as you're spending it on yourself for your own enjoyment or your own needs, that is never an improper transfer. So let's talk about the look back period. This is something that people hear a lot about, and are quite often confused about. Look back is the 5 years prior to the month that you apply for Medicaid. So when you're applying, the Medicaid caseworker is first going to determine whether you're eligible. And if you are eligible, then they look and see whether you made any improper transfer. If there's any reason to deny that application, the caseworker doesn't do the look back and doesn't impose any improper transfer penalties. You have to be otherwise eligible before they even start looking at improper transfers. But if the caseworker determines that you are eligible, but that you made improper transfers in that look back period, caseworker will approve Medicaid, but impose restricted coverage. So what is restricted coverage? That's the penalty for making improper transfers. It's not a denial of Medicaid. It's not Medicaid denied. It's a restriction on what Medicaid will pay for. In other words, and it's a restriction on Medicaid paying for the nursing home or your other long-term care program that you're applying for. The length of your restricted coverage period is based on how much you gave away in improper transfers. And Medicaid publishes this number. They revisit it every 2 years. This is sometimes it's called the Medicaid divisor. Sometimes, supposedly, this is what the average cost of long-term care is statewide, but we always laugh. It's laughably low. Good luck finding a lot of nursing homes at $7,787 a month. Around here, you're probably looking more at $9,000-$10,000 is much more common. But that's the number, and that's what Medicaid will use. So for every $7,870 of improper transfers they find, they will say, yes, you are eligible for Medicaid, but we are not going to pay for your nursing home for however many months. So you give away $70,000, it's going to be 10 months that you're going to have to private pay at the nursing home, even after you are eligible for Medicaid. So now, once your restricted coverage starts, it doesn't stop. Even if you leave the nursing home and go off of Medicaid, it still continues. So, sometimes making an application to just trigger this restricted coverage is helpful. If you're able to otherwise meet your care needs in the meantime, you can kind of ride out, having restricted coverage and get it behind you before you really need that long-term care. So, like I said, there are certain exempt transfers that these are specifically considered not improper transfers. So you can give your home to your spouse, your child who is under 21, or a child who is blind or permanently disabled, or to a trust for that child's sole benefit, or to your child who lived with you for 2 years and helped take care of you to the point where you were able to stay out of the nursing home because of the care that child was giving you. Now, there's some documentation requirements and some paperwork that the child caregiver has to be able to produce that can sometimes be a hurdle, but that exemption is there. And then one of the more rare ones, if your sibling lives with you for at least a year and who can show they have an equitable interest in the property. Maybe their name is on the deed, maybe not, but if they can show that they paid the property taxes, or they helped pay the mortgage, or something like that, then you can transfer your home to your sibling in that case. Then any assets can be transferred without penalty to your spouse or your child who's under 21, your child who is blind or disabled, or to a trust for that child, or to a trust for the sole benefit of anyone who is disabled who is under age 65. This is one where sometimes we see caseworkers getting confused, because this rule applies to anybody who is under age 65. You can set up a trust for their sole benefit, and if they are disabled, you can make transfers to that trust and it'll be exempt. It doesn't have to be your child. It doesn't even have to be your family member. It could be your friend. It could be your partner. It could be anyone. So long as they are under 65 and are disabled, you can set aside your assets, your resources for their benefit without causing a problem for your Medicaid. All right. So, Ellen, I think this is your turn to take it over.
Okay, can you just throw it all up there? And so
Sure.
that'd be easier for me. All right, so you've heard George talk about the eligibility rules and the income and resources and what you can do, or what's countable, what's not countable. So, we are getting into the weeds a little bit of this. And so I don't want to lose you in this, because we're going to talk about what are smart ways of spending down to become eligible. This is where we can help families come up with a plan that's specific to what they need. And what I would like you to take away from this, because I'm going to go through some of these spend down options, they can get very technical. So please don't get into the weeds. Just the takeaway message should be, is there's always something that can be done. Okay. And so, and just be aware that, that there are options. So what are the smart spend down options? So if one option is that you spend down paying for your care or your loved one's care. And that certainly is an option. It's a way to spend down to get to that magic number that George was talking about, where you're below the resource limit. But what the Medicaid rules allow is that you can spend for anything that you need. So it's not just for your care. It can be spent for things like things that you need in your house. It can be spent buying an exempt asset that's not going to be countable, like a vehicle. Sometimes folks are driving a car that's on its last leg, and we might say, well, just trade that in and get a newer, nicer car. There's no limit on how expensive the car is, so you can purchase a vehicle as a way of spending down. Another one that's a big one that's not very sexy or popular, but it's necessary, is to purchase a pre-need funeral for the individual who's going to be applying, or for their spouse, as well as burial spaces for the whole family. That is a allowable spend down, and it's a cost that someone's going to have to absorb at the end. So it's good if you can prepay that. You can do any kind of home remodeling or maintenance that your home requires, or your vehicle. And it's kind of weird, because sometimes folks have been saving their whole lives and putting money away, and then then they come to see us and we're looking at helping get Medicaid eligibility for one of the spouses. And we say, okay, do you need new windows? Go get new windows, go get a new roof, go get a new driveway. And it's shocking, like we're telling them to spend, but it's a better use of the funds in the long run to get things in place, rather than spending it by paying for care. And then at the end, you don't have anything more than $2,000. So to the extent that those things are needed, those are good ways of spending down, as well as new furniture, appliances, or anything that adds to your quality of life. There's also examples of hearing aids, clothing, bedding, wheelchair. Hearing aids are not covered by Medicaid, or special dental work, or those kinds of things. So that's something that the funds can be used for, as well as vacations or visiting family and friends. If you are well enough to go take a trip, go on a cruise. If you need a companion and the doctor can document that you need assistance, then you can pay for both of you to take that trip. And then you can also hire folks like care managers, care coordinators, attorneys, that if you're at that point where you're transitioning to a nursing home, and need help with the Medicaid, and want to make sure that the application gets processed accurately, then that's also a good way to spend down. Go ahead. All right, now, similarly, if you're not single and you're married, what are other ways of spending down? So one of them is that if your community spouse, the one that's not applying for Medicaid, and as George explained, they're entitled to keep half of the assets up to that $154,000 limit. Say that that's not enough because their needs are greater than that. Well, we can do things as a spend down is to purchase out of the other assets as a way, instead of spending the money down, half of that money down, we can purchase a Medicaid compliant annuity to provide additional income for the community spouse. An annuity is an income stream, and a Medicaid compliant annuity is a type of annuity that meets the Medicaid rules, essentially that it's going to be paying either over the life expectancy or a shorter period of that community spouse equal monthly payments. So if we have $300,000 to start, and this is an example, and we have to spend down 150 of it to get our applicant eligible, we can take, and we don't have those needs to prepay funerals, say we already did that, and we don't have a home improvement projects, and we hate cruising and those kinds of things, and we really need more money. One way to do that is take that 150 that has to be spent down and purchase a Medicaid compliant annuity. And now we've created more of an income stream for that community spouse. And as George mentioned earlier, that when Medicaid is looking at income, they're only looking at the applicant's income, not the community spouses. So that spouse can have an increased income. And then once the applicant is made eligible, if that income turns into a resource, now Medicaid's not looking at it anymore because they're separating the two out and they're only looking at the applicant's income and resources. So that's a good way to spend down. Let's see. I'm just trying to, all right, obtaining a Medicaid. You're right. So the last point about that is that if you're going to look at a Medicaid compliant annuity, you don't want to just get it from anybody. I've had folks who have maybe a financial advisor that they work with, and they'll say, oh, they'll get me the Medicare compliant annuity. It's a tricky thing, and there are people that specialize in purchasing those types of annuities, and you have to make sure that the Medicaid rule on that annuity is met. So you want to work through somebody that that does deal in that product specifically, and then also an elder law attorney who can guide in that process. Go ahead. All right. So we talked about spending down as far as purchasing Medicaid compliant annuities or purchasing things we need or doing home improvement, etc. Well, we also want to look at our retirement funds and what can you do with those. So retirement funds are those assets that have a special tax preferred status with the IRS. So those are things like IRAs, either Roth or the regular IRA, 401ks. Those are all the retirement accounts, pension plans, those kinds of things. So Medicaid has a different set of rules for those. So it used to be years ago where they would say, well, if you have a retirement account, and let's use an IRA as an example, is that that's going to be accountable resource if it's money you can dip into. And it might also be an income if it's paying out. Well, now what the rules say are that if you're not tapping into that IRA, say it's just sitting there, then it is accountable resource. But if it's in payout status, so say you've hit that age that requires minimum distributions and you're getting those, then it's no longer going to be accountable resource. Medicaid is only going to look at that income and count that as income to the person it's coming to. In addition, if you say you're between the ages of 59 and a half and is it 72 now that you have to start taking it, or 73? If you're in that in between stage and you haven't been taking it because you want to try to hold off, but now one of you needs to have Medicaid, well, all you have to do is set it up that you're getting a regular payment out of that IRA, and it will no longer be accountable resource. It'll just be income, and you can make it as small as $100 a month. There's no rule about how much it has to be. It just has to be a regular payment coming out of that IRA. So for somebody that's got say a $500,000 IRA sitting there, that's going to be a resource that's going to have to be or spent down, part of that spend down calculation. If you simply set it up to take out $100 a month, that's 500,000 removed, and it's no longer considered, and it doesn't have to be spent down. Okay. All right. Unique rules. Okay. So this is another example of retirement accounts. So, okay. So sometimes, so if you have an IRA, it belongs to the person who it's in an individual's name. So you can't have IRAs in both spouses' names. So it only belongs to one. And as I said, one strategy, if it's a single person, is just start taking regular minimum amounts every month. And now it's no longer an accountable asset. And if that's all you have, then you can qualify for Medicaid. And then the income is income that's paid toward patient liability. But say you have a married couple, and the one that's got the IRA is the spouse that needs the Medicaid, and the IRA is in their name. Well, one of the things that the Medicaid rules allow is that you can, instead of taking a minimum distribution, which is really not going to help the community spouse because it's going to be the institutional spouse's income, instead of doing that, we can turn that IRA by purchasing a Medicaid compliant annuity, but make it payable to the community spouse. So again, using that example, say we have a $500,000 IRA and it belongs to the institutional spouse, and instead of starting to take payments, we just convert it into this Medicaid compliant annuity and make it payable to the community spouse. So it still belongs to the IRA still belongs to the institutional spouse, but now when we've converted it, it's that the income is coming to the community spouse, and again, Medicaid's not looking at income for the community spouse. And so we're able to shift over that IRA as an income stream to that community spouse, and we have spent down $500,000 at the same time. So it's a good way to generate more assets for the community spouse. And again, if that community spouse doesn't spend that income and just socks it away into their account, well, that's okay, as long as the institutionalized spouse is now on Medicaid and continues to be Medicaid eligible. So it's a way to preserve a lot of the assets. Let's see. I can't read the rest of that. Oh, okay. I couldn't read the bottom of this last single individual whose sole significant resource. Oh, okay, I know what that means. So if you have a single individual and they have the same kind of IRA, well, maybe the best strategy is to just put it in payout status and take little amounts so they can get on Medicaid and still have access to that IRA. All right, go ahead. All right, and then this other way of planning, this other option is where we have time. So where we have the luxury of time of planning ahead. So this is where the individual does not think that they're going to need Medicaid for at least 5 years. If we're in that kind of a situation, then we can do a type of gift and wait strategy, which is where the individual can gift whatever amount they want to pass on and preserve, maybe to their heirs, to their children, grandchildren, etc. And then we start the clock ticking, and we hope to get through 60 months before we need Medicaid. And if we did get past 60 months, then those funds that were given away are not looked at. They're outside that look back period, and we can get Medicaid coverage. So one option is to make it a gift, but we typically don't recommend that we just gift the funds over, because we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what can happen over a 60-month period. And when you gift the funds directly to somebody, well, and you ask them to just sit on this and let's get through this 60 months. Well, bad things happen to good people all the time. If they get sued, if they go through a divorce, or they get injured, they have medical bills, those funds would be available to their creditors. So typically, what we would recommend is a type of trust that can be drafted where the funds go in there, so that that person we want the funds to receive in the end is the beneficiary of that trust, but it's just going to sit there and until it's no longer needed, and then it passes on. And so at minimum, you want to wait 5 years before you apply for Medicaid, and then it'll be outside that look back period. There's a caution on this slide that you want to be careful when you do that type of a strategy, even if it goes to a trust, because the drawbacks are that one of the drawbacks is that you have to give up control over those funds. So you can't be the trustee, you can't be the beneficiary. You have to have the right family dynamics where something like that can work, where you have a trustworthy child or two who can be co-trustees or trustee, with the understanding that these funds are going to just sit there and while we wait out that 5-year period. If we can't get past the 5-year period, then we want to have a plan B of how we're going to pay for that care until we get past that 5-year period, so this whole thing doesn't blow up. So it's important to work with an attorney that is familiar in Medicaid planning, so that this is done correctly. Okay. All right, so say we don't have 5 years, and it's what we call crisis Medicaid planning. So somebody shows up at our door, and maybe their husband or wife is in a nursing home, and now they're being told, well, Medicare is going to stop paying for their care tomorrow or next week, and you're going to be private pay. And so now we're in that crisis mode. Like, what do? We've already had the snapshot day, as George explained. They've already had their day, maybe their 30 days of institutionalization or day one or whatever. What can we do? Well, we know we can't do a 5-year plan anymore. But there are things we can do. We can do, if depending on the size of the estate, we can do some sort of an intentional gifting and then have some exempt assets to pay for that person's care while they get through their restricted coverage. So let me try to give you an example of that. So say, I'm going to make it simple. So I'm going to say we give away $80,000. And then we know that we're going to get approximately 7+ months of restricted coverage. That'll be the penalty period. But maybe we have another 80,000 and we put that into a type of a trust, which I don't think we talked about pool trusts, but it's a type of trust that we can set up and for the person that's applying for Medicaid, and that is exempt. It's not countable. It's permissible under the rules. And so we gave away 80,000 and then we funded a pool trust with 80,000. And we know we're going to have this 7-month period of penalty. And so on month 1, we have the trust pay the nursing home cost. And every month they do that. That's how we get through that penalty period. That's just an example of how to, as an option when we're doing crisis planning. We can also do the Medicaid compliant annuity because there's no look back on that. Or we can start an IRA and payout status. Those are all permissible things. So again, the takeaway is that there's always something that can be done if you do this thoughtfully and based on what your needs are. Okay. I think it's back to George.
Okay. So we are getting close to our time here. So I am going to kind of get just the real high points of the next few slides here. When you're applying for Medicaid, again, there's those non-financial and financial criteria. The non-financial is evaluated by either the nursing home, which does an assessment and forwards that to Medicaid, or if you're doing assisted living or passport or home care, your local area agency on aging. In this area, it's either Western Reserve or Direction Home that will conduct that assessment, forward that along to Medicaid to confirm that you meet that level of care. So either way, you're going to have somebody involved to do these level of care assessments. The financial criteria. This is your wonderful local Department of Job and Family Services at your county level. They will review and evaluate whether you are financially eligible. You can apply by mail, by sending a fax. Some counties will allow you to submit an application by email. You can go in person, or you can use the online portal. We recommend not using the online portal. It is broken and they have no plans to fix it. We generally prefer using a fax. There's nothing more, nothing confirms the date of an application better than a fax with a fax confirmation sheet that it was received at a specific date and time. How long it takes to process the application, that'll vary between counties and sometimes case by case. The bigger, more populous counties, your Cuyahoga, your Franklin, your Summit, they have a greater workload. They take a little longer. Smaller counties, your Geaugas, your Lakes, your Lorains, you can usually get through. You can usually get that through in quicker fashion. The person applying or somebody who they have named as their authorized representative is the one who's responsible for providing all the information the county asks for. And if they don't supply this information or supply it timely, the case can be denied for failing to provide that information. And I can tell you, as somebody who does Medicaid applications as a core part of their career, this process is frequently frustrating, confusing, difficult. You will often have, I'll have one case that it will be treated one way, and another case that seems identical, and it will be treated another way. And sometimes it seems there's no rhyme or reason. Finally, you've gotten your eligibility in place, you've made your application, you are approved, you are on Medicaid. What do you need to think about now? So you want to make sure that your loved one is continuing to get good quality of care. The care providers in a nursing home are supposed to not be made aware of who is a Medicaid recipient and who is not. That information is supposed to be kept confidential and strictly in the billing system. It is not to be shared with the care providers. So I think a lot of people get concerned sometimes about, if I go on Medicaid, they're not going to treat me very nicely. That generally isn't the case that I see. The bigger thing with that is making sure that you are keeping up on what's being done and how your loved one's being cared for. Show up, visit don't visit at the same time of day, visit at different times of day, have different people visit. Keep an eye on these folks, because their hearts are in the right place, but they're overworked, they're understaffed, they're underpaid, and sometimes corners get cut. The other thing to keep in mind is once somebody's on Medicaid, they still will have to pay for some share of cost. This is their patient liability, and it's based on that individual income. Again, they start with their gross income. They'll give them allowances for health insurance premiums, maybe some allocation to a spouse, a very small personal needs allowance of $50. And then the rest of that arithmetic equation is how much you pay the nursing home every month. A benefit of using that name on the check rule, if we can get the income from one spouse made payable to the other, it's not part of that patient liability calculation. So we look to do that as much as we can. Finally, after the person passes, there's potentially estate recovery. This is Ohio Medicaid has a statutory right to recover against anything that was in that Medicaid recipient's name at the moment that they died. Now, there's some exceptions and exemptions here. If you have a surviving spouse, there will be no estate recovery while that spouse is alive. There's some other hardship exemptions. That caregiver child exemption applies here. Those 21 children under 21 or disabled children applies here. Or if there is a compelling hardship, and that's kind of a case by case sort of question. How Medicaid's made aware of potential recovery if your estate goes through probate, or if you have things that are transfer on death, when whatever paperwork is filed to clear title to that, and the Attorney General's office that enforces estate recovery contracts out to local law firms to kind of comb through the death records and the probate records and make inquiries when somebody who's been a Medicaid recipient passes away, to see if there are any assets that may be made available and are recoverable by estate recovery. Perhaps surprisingly, these folks are somewhat reasonable in their approach. You would expect them to be much more hard-nosed than they actually are. They don't want to throw people out of their houses. They don't want to put people in poverty. They don't want to throw people on the street. So if you get a notice about Medicaid estate recovery, give somebody like us a call, because frequently we can negotiate a better outcome with this whole thing. So we had to rush through the end there, but I'm glad that you folks stayed with us. This is going to be put up on our website, both the recording and the slides, PowerPoint slides themselves. I know this was technical and got into a lot of detail here. Like Ellen has said, I want your takeaway tonight to be there's lots that you can do, and that knowing and having an expert in this kind of stuff on your side is going to make you able to take advantage and make a lot of options available that the nursing home's not going to tell you about, the area agency is not going to tell you about, social workers at the hospital aren't going to tell you about, because they don't know. This stuff is complex unless you do it day in, day out, every day like we do. You're not going to catch everything. So use these slides as a resource, but I would encourage you, if you have questions or you want to talk about your specific situation, give our office a call. I'm happy to usually talk to folks, at no charge for 10, 15 minutes about something. Or if we really need to get down to it, we do consultations, and we'll really answer and dig into your issues and tell you what's going on. So our contact information's on there. Check us out on our website, and we'll look forward to hearing from you guys.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.